Alright, welcome back to the Pickaxe channel where I guess we're doing Deltarune theories now. I'm honestly blown away by how well my Death Knight video did. I mean, I was hoping people would see it, but I had no idea the sheer amount of traction it would get. I kind of made that one on a whim, and so, yeah, overall I'm super thankful to everyone who watched it, liked it, and left comments on it. And, yeah, speaking of Death Knight, I should clarify that this is going to be a sort of Death Knight-centric video. And obviously I'm not one of those people who thinks Death Knight is already canon or looks down on other Knight theories, but, you know, fair warning. So, with that rambling aside, I think it's time to get into the first section of this video. Something I want to talk about is the many faces of Death Knight, as I like to call it. So, Death Knight kind of presents itself as one unified theory, and it makes sense, you know, I think Death is the Knight, that's one theory. But if you look closely, it's actually sort of a bunch of different theories in a trench coat. There's sort of a divide as to whether this is just straight up Death herself, or if it's like her animated corpse which she's being puppeted around by Gaster or something like that. There is a lot of weirdness surrounding the Knight that makes it hard to believe they're just like an ordinary person. And personally, I've never really known which side of the debate to put myself on, which is why my video on Death Knight didn't really go into detail on that sort of thing. But recently I watched the amazing Echo Knight video by Starrays, which, by the way, is really good. A link to their video is in the description. Highly suggest checking it out. And I kind of had an epiphany, and it led me to come up with a theory of my own that is definitely distinct, not really like anything else I've seen, but is, you know, sort of inspired by Echo Knight. And it's also kind of inspired by a comment from that video I'll put on screen right now. But with all that aside, I think it's time I get into the main pillar this theory will be built upon. And that pillar is text from a book we find in Chapter 4, Second Sanctuary, and now I will read it out to you. "And so wept the fallen star, making rivers from its tears. Then, slowly, from the bitter water, something grew. It looked like glass." Now, when we think of glass in Deltarune, what comes to mind? Of course there's the shadow crystal, but there's also the black shard, which is also glass, and is even more directly tied to the Knight. And I personally believe this text is talking about black shards as opposed to shadow crystals, as Shum tells us in Chapter 5 that shadow crystals are generally formed from lost dreams, whereas this text depicts a more specific event. Now that begs the question, who or what is the fallen star? I think it's Death. Death is pretty heavily associated with stars, considering the stars on the wall of her room, and the fact that as a musician she's sort of a literal star in a way, like a rock star. And there's also the fact that the room containing this book is the one linked to the secret therapy room where you find the Chapter 4 egg, and it has the Roots Prophecy panel in it. A lot of stuff I believe is at least tangentially related to Death's disappearance. So, I claim that the Tears of the Fallen Star created the Black Shards, and that Death is said fallen star. But there's still more to this theory. I think that Death disappeared at the lake. This is a pretty big claim, so let's go through why I think it's the case. Okay, so, there's a theory called the Roots Theory by GoldPro, which will be linked in the description by the way. I won't go through the whole thing, but one thing it's mentioned is that the third board in the Shadowmantle video game section lines up with Hometown in the Light World. And specifically, the room that would line up with the position of the lake has a mysterious all-black monster inside of it. However, if you flip a hidden variable in the game's code called Toriel, the sprite will turn into a black deer. And I think that black deer is supposed to represent December holiday. Which, if true, would suggest that Death is associated with the lake somehow. But that's not all. I have a theory about how and why Death disappeared that's connected to the lake. Okay, so, in the Chapter 5 Weird Route, Noelle and Chris walk through the lake in an attempt to get to the other side. With this, I am getting into speculation territory, but I believe that the Chapter 5 Weird Route is actually a parallel to what happened to Death. Noelle mentions that the four of them always wanted to see what was on the other side of the lake. The four of us being Chris, Noelle, Azriel, and Death. Noelle goes on to say that she feels trapped by the day-to-day monotony of her life, and I suspect Death might have felt the same way considering her overall sort of rebellious characterization. And so I believe that Death tried to get to the other side of the lake, just like Chris and Noelle in the Weird Route, and I think she got to the same place we did. I think there's a dark world under the lake, and I think that is where Death ended up. In the files of the game, we can find some text hidden in the code with a new bit with every chapter that releases. I think a pretty large portion of the community would agree with me when I say I think this is December. With the way she talks about being lost in an unknown place, it lines up with our lost girl being lost in the dark. Now, I'm going to say something perhaps a bit controversial, and it's that I don't think the text we're seeing here is exactly chronological with the game's chapters. If we are to believe this is Des, it would make no sense for her to suddenly say, "Where am I?" after being lost for several years. I think the voice in the code, or at least the first sample we find, is from a long time ago. So, I've claimed that the black shards are from Des's tears, and that she got trapped in the Lake Darkworld while trying to run away from home, but what does all of this even mean? Well, I'll tell you. I believe that one night, Des, in search of an escape from the monotony of life, or in rebellion against her parents, ran away from home, attempting to get to the other side of the lake. But then, just like Chris and Noelle do in Chapter 5, Des crosses over into somewhere new, somewhere I think is a dark world. And so wept the fallen star, making rivers from her tears. Then, slowly, from the bitter water, something grew. It looked like glass. That's right. I believe that the night is made of Des's tears, or rather, the black shards, the same one that is found at the scene of her disappearance. We know that the black shard can exist in the light world, which explains how the night is able to kidnap people, move around in the light world, while also having all this weird shape-shifting an ordinary lightener couldn't do. I think that the night is a representation of Des's anguish and frustrations against the world, which is why the night wants to cause the roaring. I think Susie was right, and the night just wants to see the world burn. Exactly like how Noelle wanted to get away from hometown in the Weird Route. I think there's precedent for this with Flowey and Undertale. Flowey was made in Azrael's image, but he doesn't have a soul, which made him cruel and uncaring, just like how the night seems to behave. We also know that dark worlds can create darkness patterned after people in the form of Gerson, and that concepts like lost dreams can manifest into the light world, so I think there's some direct Deltarune precedent for this theory as well. And I think Des, or her soul, or whatever is left of her is still down there, beneath the lake, and she is the one who makes the mysterious song from the sea. There are 2 Decembers. One, the night, who represents her wrath and her frustration at the world, and another who represents her hope and her bonds. I don't think this theory is perfect, but I do think it fixes quite a few holes in Des Night. Like how the Night's actions and the voice in the code are so different, and how the Night functions in the light world, and why there's a black shard at the site of Des's disappearance. This is the Shard Night theory. Now, with the main sort of theory established, there are a few more things I wanted to go over that I couldn't quite fit into the main theory. First up is Chris. I think Chris was involved in this whole incident. Now, I don't think Chris is necessarily responsible for it, not in a malicious way, but I do think Des roped them into this somehow. In the song Raise Up Your Bat, which is one of the few looks into Des's character, there are lyrics about a heart acting as an ark. An ark is a kind of boat, so there's a water parallel, but perhaps this lyric is supposed to represent how Des intended for Chris to act as her guide for the trip to the other side of the lake, only for Chris to fail in some way. I think Chris could potentially have been the last person to see her, or was even there at the scene. I also think this is why Chris feels a lot of guilt. I think Chris is guilty that they didn't try to stop her, or that they helped her, or maybe that they even failed to help her. I think Carol is using this guilt to manipulate Chris at the end of Chapter 4. I think this might be why Chris is working with the Knight, and that the Knight is a sort of manifestation of Des, is manipulating them somehow. As I mentioned before, the book about the fallen star is right before the art therapy scene, and also in the third mantle game board, you stab the black deer enemy that I believe represents Des. I personally interpret this as more figurative than literal, as in I don't think Chris literally stabbed Des, but it's more so commenting about their guilt and how they regret their actions or inaction. Now on to some kind of miscellaneous stuff about the Knight's physiology. It's sort of unclear just how intelligent the Knight is. It's pretty clear they can understand language and also body language with how Chris signals to the Knight in Chapter 3. They also seem to be vulnerable to taunts, with how Susie goads them into spawning the Titan, and Flowery tricks them into running into a wall. It's unclear whether or not the Knight can talk. We never see them do it, but we don't know whether that's by choice or not. And also, kind of a pet theory I've been thinking about is that the Knight is either weakened by or even hurt by the sun. In Chapter 1, Sham warns us about the sun going down. And also, the Knight tends to only really be active during the night. The only exception to this seems to be Chapter 4, though I think you could argue the clouds are blocking the sun, because we can see it rain shortly after leaving the holiday house. This isn't really related to Shard Knight, but I thought I'd throw it in there because I found it interesting. So yeah, that's Shard Knight theory, as I like to call it, though I imagine there's someone in the comments who has already come up with a far superior name. I think it's definitely pretty out there, and I do assume quite a few things to make it work, but honestly, I still think I'm quite proud of this one. I mean, the things I'm least confident on, like Des's motivations for entering the lake and Chris's involvement, can still totally be wrong and the theory can still work, So I'm cautiously optimistic, but then again, each chapter seems to prove around 90% of our theories wrong. If you guys have any thoughts on this theory or anything that I missed, feel free to leave a comment. I might not be able to get to all of them, but I do enjoy reading them. Have a nice day.